This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show,
she was always, again, we talk about that hypervigilance, always very fearful and defensive. And then as she aged and developed dementia, it just became untenable. After a time, it was a sort of a strange thing that happened. I just found as though like this kind of dinger descended out of the sky and hit me on the head. I just stopped feeling angry with her. Having an understanding of what has happened to other people and why they may be doing what they're doing or reacting in this way is useful.
Annette Pember's mother, Bernice Rabideau, was forced into a boarding school for Indigenous children during the Great Depression. Today we're going to be in conversation with Annette Pember about her mother, her relationship to her mother, and the history of boarding schools. Annette Pember is the author of the book Medicine River, A Story of Survival and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools. That's next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Scott Baba. Hamas released all 20 remaining living hostages into the custody of the Red Cross today, which then brought them to Israel. And Israel said it has released more than 1,900 Palestinian prisoners as part of the Gaza ceasefire deal, halting 2 years of devastating war. The truce, brokered by the United States and Egypt, paused fighting that killed tens of thousands of Palestinians and left much of Gaza in ruins. Charles de Ledesma has more.
Israel's begun releasing more than 1,900 Palestinian prisoners and detainees as part of the ceasefire deal. Several of the men who stepped off the buses say they couldn't even explain their joy after decades behind bars. Kamal Abu Shanab, a 51-year-old Fatah member from Tulkarm, tells the AP it was an incredible journey of suffering, hunger, unfair treatment, oppression, torture and curses. More than anything you could imagine. His face gaunt and his head shaved, Abu Shanab's own family said they barely recognized him. His niece, Farah Abu Shanab, says he's not the person we know. Our uncle doesn't look like our uncle. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
The moment remains fragile, with Israel and Hamas still in the early stages of implementing the first phase of Trump's plan. The sides have not agreed on Gaza's post-war governance, the territory's reconstruction, and Israel's demand that Hamas disarms. Negotiations over those issues could break down, and Israel has hinted it may resume military operations if its demands are not met. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump is urging world leaders to, quote, put the old feuds to rest and seize momentum, calling the ceasefire deal the first steps to peace. Trump is in Egypt for a global summit on Gaza's future. The summit is co-hosted with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and aims to advance peace in the Middle East. More than 24 countries are expected to attend. The summit follows Trump's visit to Israel, where he celebrated a U.S.-brokered ceasefire with Hamas. Sagar Magani reports.
President Trump is urging Israel to build on a fragile U.S.-brokered truce with Hamas. As he addressed Israeli lawmakers,
generations from now, this will be remembered as the moment that everything began to change
toward what he hopes is peace for all eternity. To that end,
Israel, with our help, has won all that they can by force of arms. You've won.
The president pushing the Israelis to work on peace after 2 years of war.
I am committed to this peace.
The president and Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu raised hopes the war may end. And even as hundreds of Palestinian prisoners held in Israel walked free, along with all 20 remaining living hostages in Gaza, there are still fundamental questions over when and how the fighting might stop. Sagar Magani, Washington.
Madagascar's president, Andre Rajoelina, has left the country after an elite military unit turned against the government in an apparent coup. This according to an opposition lawmaker in the Indian Ocean country today. The comments came shortly before Rajoelina was due to appear on national television to make a speech to the people of Madagascar following weeks of deadly anti-government protests. Those protests, which were initially led by youth groups, reached a turning point on Saturday when soldiers from the elite Capsat military unit accompanied demonstrators to a square in the capital of Antananarivo and called for Rajoelina and several government ministers to leave office. The unit, which helped Rajoelina first come into power as transitional leader in a military-backed coup in 2009, said that it had taken charge of all the armed forces in Madagascar. Brigadier General Nonos Binanami Mahmalisan, Malagasy National Gendarme Commander, praised protests for Railina's ouster.
All the use of force will be stopped from now on. The people work for the benefit of the many, not for the few. The Zandari thanks Gen Z and all those who woke up and stood up.
The death toll from last week's torrential rains in east-central Mexico has jumped to 64. Search operations have expanded to communities cut off by landslides. Authorities today said 65 people are missing. The scale of destruction across 5 states is becoming clear. The Civil Protection Agency said the heavy rains killed 29 people in Veracruz State, 21 in Hidalgo, and 13 in Puebla, plus 1 in Querétaro. President Claudia Sheinbaum says it could still be days before access is established to some places. In northern Veracruz, 80 communities remain inaccessible by road. A new round of layoffs at the Education Department is depleting an agency that was hit hard in the Trump administration's previous mass firings, threatening new disruption to the nation's students and schools in areas from special education to civil rights enforcement and after-school programs. The Trump administration started laying off 466 Education Department staffers on Friday amid mass firings across the government meant to pressure Democratic lawmakers over the federal shutdown. The layoffs would cut the agency's workforce by nearly a fifth and leave it reduced by more than half its size when President Trump first took office on January 20th. The cuts play into Trump's broader plan to shut down the Education Department completely and parcel its operations to other agencies. Over the summer, the department started handing off its adult education and workforce programs to the Department of Labor, and it previously said it was negotiating an agreement to pass its $1.6 trillion student loan portfolio to the Treasury Department. Department officials have not released details on the layoffs and did not immediately respond to a request for comment. AFGE Local 252, a union that represents more than 2,700 department workers, said information from employees indicates cuts will decimate several offices within the agency. California Governor Gavin Newsom has signed a new law aimed at protecting children whose parents are deported. The measure, Assembly Bill 495, expands who can use a caregiver's authorization affidavit, a form that allows an adult to enroll a child in school or consent to medical care. The law broadens eligibility to include more extended relatives like cousins or great-aunts if parents are detained or deported. The bill also bans daycare providers from collecting immigration information and lets parents' names temporary guardians through family court. I'm Scott Baba.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of boarding schools for Indigenous children, really from after the Civil War until the 1970s. Many children during this span of time were taken from their families, many of them forcibly, to live at these schools where they were forced to work and where the schools, mostly run by churches, try to get these children to unlearn their own communities' ways of life and take up a more mainstream, mostly white way of life. My guest today, Mary Annette Pember, has a very personal connection to this history, as many Indigenous people do. Her mother was forced into a boarding school at the age of 5. Mary Annette Pember has written a memoir about her mom and about boarding schools. It is called Medicine River, A Story of Survival and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools. Mary Annette Pember is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Wisconsin Ojibwe. She is currently the national correspondent for ICT News, formerly known as Indian Country Today. Mary Annette Pember, it's my good pleasure to welcome you to this program. Thank you for taking this time.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Tell me about your mom, Bernice Robideau. Again, this is a memoir. This is about your relationship to your mom. This is about your mom's experience in these boarding schools, about your mom's experience with her mom as well. But your mom saw you as the one who was going to tell this story, didn't she?
Yeah, she very much did. She didn't really talk to my brothers about it. I grew up with a half brother and then one brother we shared the same parentage. But she didn't really tell them anything about it. But these were my the stories about her time at the boarding school, St. Mary's. Catholic boarding school on the Bad River Reservation in Wisconsin. They were my bedtime stories, really. And she called it, the people there called the school the sister school. And the sisters, that was actually kind of for a period of time, the running title was Sister School Stories. I grew up listening to those, and she would tell them usually with herself as, really triumphant, as somebody who's, the little girl who stood up for herself, and which she did. But, when I was really little, she didn't always include some of the more painful parts of the stories, and those I kind of uncovered for myself much later.
Do your mom just recognize that you are a storyteller? I mean, you've written a book. You're a journalist. I even heard the special you did on Reveal, the 2-part podcast on boarding schools. Do you think your mom recognized that you are a storyteller? Do you think it was because you're the daughter?
Well, Ojibwe women are storytellers. That is kind of our job in the culture, if you will, especially as we get older. We are older women, like old ladies. The term for old lady is the one who holds things together, and of the way that we hold things together is through story. So Ojibwe women are really known for their storytelling abilities. So I think that it was just sort of a natural relationship, that she felt that, that we had, and so that was, I think, some of what motivated her to pass it on to me. And I think she also felt that as a Native woman, I would need as much help as I could get to survive in this white world.
Again, your mom was she forcibly taken at the age of 5 into the boarding school?
It was forcibly in the sense that there was no place else for her to go. Her parents had broken up, and she was staying with her grandparents, who really, at that time, it was during the Great Depression, and they really didn't have the finances to care for them. And that was the only alternative at the time. So they were placed in the sister school, she and her siblings.
And they were placed together?
Yes, they were all placed together, correct.
And again, this is technically known as St. Mary's Catholic Indian Mission School in Wisconsin?
Correct. It changed names occasionally. It was St. Mary's Industrial Indians Boarding School. School is now closed. However, the little parish is still there. The little church is still there.
I think everyone knows the term and has heard about boarding schools, but maybe not precisely understand what they were. How do you describe what a boarding school was?
Well, students, it was the whole boarding school program was really part of a much broader series of assimilationist policies that the federal government pursued, especially after the Civil War, though it was, it has far deeper roots, actually, that predate the establishment of the United States. Missionaries have always come here, even early on with the explorers, with some of the, the express mission to convert Native people and to extinguish their culture, if you will, as a means to sort of, to get access to their resources and so on. So it became formalized really after the Civil War. And in addition to other policies such as Indian removal in the 1830s, taking people, away from their land and moving them often, west of the Mississippi, and allotment, which in many ways was more effective and more devastating than boarding schools, just the whole process of this sort of forced education and acculturation, separating people from their lands and their means to provide for their families. That was especially effective. So it was like, I often describe it as sort of a triple whammy that happened to Native people after the Civil War. Taken together, these assimilationist policies were incredibly effective, but not, but they didn't stamp out our languages and cultures entirely. But it was really part of this broader effort, to separate us from our resources. And the way that people felt would be most effective would be to extinguish our culture and languages.
Were these schools, were they places where kids mostly went to work?
It was the education was really primarily labor oriented. There wasn't really much in the way of what we would think of today as education, kind of very basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. But it was primarily to teach Native people how to be part of white culture at a very, kind of rudimentary level as servants. So there was a great emphasis placed on manual labor, and children often had to raise their own food. And they would, produce clothing and so on. So a great deal of the day is spent at boarding schools and even at day schools. Not everybody boarded at the schools. Later, they, created a lot of day schools as well. But there was a great emphasis placed on labor.
Richard Henry Pratt, who founded one of the country's first Native American boarding schools, famously said this was meant to kill the Indian and save the man.
Yes, and I think at that time that was really seen as, very progressive. And it was like a more humane alternative to outright extermination, which was really the only alternative at that time. And additionally, it was far cheaper. It was really expensive to kill Indians and to war against Indians, but taking the children away from their homes and, extinguishing their culture and language was far cheaper, and they felt would have a lasting impact. So at the time, he was really seen as a kind of a rabid reformer. Which, of course, looking back seems kind of absurd. However, it was really, we're looking at the dawn of the progressive era. So, he had the ear, of a lot of reformers of that era. So he had a great deal of support.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the progressive era, that the formation of a lot of this is during this progressive era. And this, I guess, is a fine example of the racism that came with that progressive era.
Exactly.
Tell me about your mom's experience in a boarding school. What stories did she tell you?
Well, she would talk a lot about, although she was frequently, beaten and so on. For her, really, what much more painful were the messages, that she received, that she was just sort of a priori as a Native person, she was bad and wrong, and everything about that was bad and wrong and needed to be changed. They would often call her dirty Indian, and that was just sort of in general, the terms that they would use, in the school. And I think in general the message was, you children, you're not right. You're not, you've had an substandard birth and upbringing, and we're going to help you overcome that, by writing it over with these, sort of emphasis of hard work. There was such an emphasis on labor very, very early on. It was that somehow the people were very concerned that Native people didn't work all the time. And I think early on people, they did work, but they didn't, do this sort of mindless labor, which was what was envisioned. Even the first, the person who was first appointed as the head of the Indian office was a Quaker named Thomas McKinney. And I have a great quote from him that he talks about, it's hard manual labor that these Indians need. We really need to inculcate them, with an acceptance for this hard labor. And even far earlier than that, in writings that Jesuit missionaries would return to Europe, they would complain about Native people not working hard enough and not working all the time. And I think probably what happened, Native people would binge work, if there was something that, if they were harvesting something, hunting and so on. And in between times, they would spend time talking and creating consensus and so on. And that just outraged these people, the missionaries especially, that these Indians were just sitting around talking too much and they weren't working and producing tangible results of their labor.
Yeah, binge working. I've heard that's sort of the natural way of working because, for thousands of years we're dealing with agriculture and there are moments of intense work in which you got to do a lot. And then there's just a lot of waiting for things to work their magic after you've done the work.
Well, and this, talking and creating consensus and also, really nurturing and supporting the culture. I mean, those were things that were, really important to Native people and that are still really important to Native people.
Is anyone making a profit off this labor?
Well, I think, there wasn't a whole lot of profit in terms of, the federal government or so on. I mean, but I think it did, when we look at especially the Catholic Church, I think that really their labor with Native people, with, education and with healthcare and so on, I mean, that helped really, helped place them, in the position they have today in the United States, and they have great influence. So I think in many ways their success was paid by their work with Native people.
How does this work? Are these federal government run? I mean, I'm sure there's even some diversity amongst these schools and how they operate and where they come from. But largely speaking, are these federal government sponsored schools that are run by the church, or?
Well, there are some. So, we need to define what one period we're talking about. So we're talking about, sort of the heyday, if you will, of the boarding school era. You're talking post-Civil War up until the early 20th century. So it was a federal program, run by basically money from trust and treaty funds. By the way, and there is a class action lawsuit that was just recently brought against the government and the Department of the Interior, naming the current Secretary Doug Borglum, and asking for an accounting of all the money, the trust and treaty funds that were spent, that were actually part of treaties. There were like 2/3 of the treaties made with Native people had an element regarding education, providing education. So they're seeking an accounting of that. I'm sorry, and I kind of lost.
Yeah, I was just we were getting into the connection between federal government and different time periods and everything. Yeah.
So some of the schools were directly funded and are still directly funded by the federal government. However, there were a number of schools, primarily Catholic schools in the late 18th, or rather late 19th and early 20th century, that received federal funding in order to educate Native people. There was a Supreme Court decision actually in 1908, Quick Bear v. Luke, that found that it was not, did not run counter to the constitutional separation of church and state for Indians to, quote unquote, exercise their choice in how their monies were spent to educate their children. Conversely, of course, Native people at the time couldn't practice their spirituality, which was illegal because of the Indian Code of Courts system, but they did devise a workaround so that federal monies could be used. So Native people had to agree, and the way that they often agreed was by signing on to a petition, and most people were illiterate at that time. And so I actually was able to find some of these petitions that were signed basically by people's thumbprints. And the reason people did it is because frequently the Catholic schools and the religious schools were operated closer to the reservation, so at least they could see their children occasionally.
Didn't the federal government also give the land to these schools and to the churches, land that was indigenous land?
Oh, yeah. But, during the allotment period, and even there were many special kind of presidential decisions, executive orders, if you will, giving full allotments to churches. And I've kind of fiddled around with trying to find an accounting of that. Certainly in the, I did find one document, and this is just the Catholic Church. And remember, there were many other Christian denominations that also operated the schools, although towards the end it was primarily the Catholics. I did find one document, and we're probably talking about now, in excess of probably 10,000 acres that is still owned by churches, and we really don't know, or, subsidiaries, or, there's no real central ownership in the Catholic Church. And that's sort of the Catholic Church's workaround often. There is no centralized Catholic Church, if you will. It's like maybe the schools or the lands are owned by various orders, priests and nuns, or by various parishes or other sort of Catholic organizations. But yeah, they still own this land, and technically it should have been, if it's no longer functioning as a school, it was supposed to be returned to the tribes, and I think in a lot of cases that hasn't happened.
This is still an issue today, then?
Still an issue today. There's never been a full accounting.
And tribes are trying to get this land back?
We still don't know. They're trying to find out how much land and where it is. So they're still looking, for an accounting. And then presumably the next step would be trying to find out about getting the land returned. The land actually where the Wounded Knee battle occurred, or it was actually the Wounded Knee massacre, was owned by Red Cloud School until pretty recently, and they finally returned it to the tribe.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Mary Annette Pember. She is the author of the book Medicine River, A Story of Survival and Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools. You just mentioned Red Cloud Indian School. You've done a lot of reporting about what is happening at the school. I referenced earlier, I did listen to the 2-part documentary that you did for Reveal on this. It was a very deep 2-part documentary about this particular boarding school. Can you tell me about it?
You would put me on the spot for that. It's been a while. It's been a couple of years since I did this. Well, there were a lot of allegations that about deaths at the school over the years. And the school is very old. I mean, it's probably one of the oldest. It no longer boards students, but it actually predates the formation of the Pine Ridge, of the Oglala Sioux Tribal Reservation. So it's been around for a really long time, and there were a lot of allegations about children dying there, and where they were buried and so on, and then there have been a lot of stories with and then the community the little town of Pine Ridge, which is actually the administrative base of the Oglala Sioux tribe. Allegations about people being buried in secret and hidden burials, hidden graves, and so we went out to try to find out about that, and they finally did do some remote sensing, trying to get a sense if there were any anomalies, and they did find a couple, and they did unearth them, and they did not find any burials, but there's just they have a long presence there on the reservation, and people that live there have a lot of questions about the history and how they came to possess as much land as they did and do, and their role in the community. I think it's some people are have proudly do attend. Now it's not called Red Cloud School anymore. When it originally was called Holy Rosary School, and then it was named after former Chief Red Cloud. And then now it has another name that I think is in the Lakota language. But there's a lot of ambivalence about that school, I think. The Jesuits essentially have played and continue to play an enormous role in it. It's really a rather exclusive school. You're not going to find a lot of support for instance, if people were to need any kind of real educational support, or if children who face any kind of developmental delays and so on. I mean, they really like to educate the cream of the crop. And one has to have a lot of support to go to that school, and have a lot of brain power, and then consequently they are able to claim that great success. So in some ways, as you can see, it's sort of a double-edged sword. As I said, people feel a little ambivalent about that school.
Yeah, and a lot of questions. Again, a lot of graves of children. Again, there's a time when childhood mortality was much higher than we'd recognize today. Yet there are questions as if some of these kids were even killed en masse.
I hear those stories often. Unfortunately, I haven't really been able to find any concrete evidence. There's always a lot of stories about babies being thrown into incinerators, and which I assume would be unwanted pregnancies. And those are stories that sort of permeate Indian country. But I haven't really been able to find a smoking gun on that. So I've been reluctant to report about it.
Yeah. What you found is sort of the conditions that you found at this school common amongst boarding schools?
Well, as I said, if we're talking in the present day,
yeah,
I would say no. And again, it's not a boarding school today. It doesn't board. It's a day school. There are still some government-supported Bureau of Indian Education, which is under the agency of the Department of the Interior, that does fund some boarding schools and some day schools in Indian country. It's tremendously underfunded agency. Often the buildings are not in very good shape. And although the pay is not bad for teachers and so on, the remoteness, it doesn't seem to really attract a lot of teachers and support staff. Many of the schools are sort of billed as therapeutic. For children who may be struggling with, maybe family issues or mental health issues or developmental challenges, those, and the services are not available at their home reservation, those, the parents may opt to send the children to these schools. But unfortunately, they're not really very well funded. And we often have, we have reports about wrongdoing and just really poorly provided services. But the Bureau of Indian Education is also a very opaque agency. So it's been very difficult to report on them.
What are the long-term effects of boarding schools? What do we know?
Well, again, the boarding schools of today, I think, are not, they have changed quite a bit in their focus. But historically, the boarding schools my mother attended, my grandmother attended, my aunts and uncles, and many of my cousins attended, was really this, constant messaging of being wrong and being a bad person, being told that you're bad and that you're wrong, over and over again, generationally. Not surprisingly, has a bad impact on people. And also being separated from your family, not being able to access nurturing of your family also has a negative impact on people. And I think particularly on my mother, who never forgave her mother for abandoning her. What she felt was abandonment. And her mother, in reading my book, you'll find that my grandmother really had no choice. I mean, it was straight up bare bones survival. Physical survival for her really required leaving her children, and they were cared for, which they weren't cared for in a very thoughtful way or a very nurturing way, but physically they did survive. But that survival has come at a real cost, and a cost that I think in many ways has been handed down, even to people like me and even subsequent generations. That messaging, it kind of took root in us, and it's I think it would have happened to any group of people. I don't think it happened to Native people because we're biologically inferior in some way, or we're too weak. I think had any group of people, race of people, if you will, were subjected to such conditions over generations, they would find that they would carry forward, some of these really trauma responses to being raised in that way. So that's something that I very much, saw in my mother. I think she struggled a lot with mental illness, and I think a lot of it was brought on by, we could talk about, response to trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. And she did not have. There was really no venue and no mechanism at all for, one didn't talk about those things. I mean, you just went on, she just survived. But I think it really took a terrible toll on her, and she did not parent us in a good way because of that.
I want to come back to that about your mother and your grandmother here in a moment, but I do want to ask about your thoughts about how trauma can affect people's genes and if it could be passed down through genes.
Well, that's something we have to be careful about discussing because it's complicated. And the reason that I think we have to be very careful is because we can get over into something called eugenics, which, really actually enforced a lot of federal policies and kind of continues to today, that some people are just biologically inferior, prone to disease, and sort of, physically weak. And that's not the case. One doesn't inherit that. What one can inherit is the way that the genes would express themselves. So, for instance, if you are subjected to this ongoing, perhaps let's use an example like hunger, and of always being subjected to this, well, it might activate certain responses in us that we might pass on, to our progeny. But it isn't, I think expressing it as a trait is a real mistake. I think, how to say this? It's sort of a difficult needle to thread. But as I said, I think if had any race of people been subjected to these kinds of conditions, they might have reacted in this way. So people might, react to stress and to trauma in ways, that may have been activated by certain gene expressions. But it's still, it's an experimental science that we're talking, epigenetics that we're talking about. And there has been a great deal of research looking at people who survived the Holocaust and their progeny and, the impact on them. So, it is, like I said, it's complex, and I think we have to be really careful about the way that we talk about it, because I think it sends that really terrible message that, unfortunately, forwarded a lot of federal policy, both here and in Canada. For instance, when there was this big surge in tuberculosis after the Civil War, as we started seeing a lot of immigration from Europe and people were crammed into these terrible and unhealthy environments, they started, it was just sort of these perfect environments for contagion. So people started contracting tuberculosis. And in Canada, for instance, the bureaucrats working, in Indian agencies constructed a kind of tuberculosis they called Indian TB. And, they constructed this framework that Native people were more prone to getting TB because they were weak. And of course, that's not the case, at all. I mean, as I said, they were forced to live in what could arguably be these perfect situations in which, diseases were contracted. And the disease of the era was tuberculosis.
Yeah, the eugenics movement, also the progressive era, right? Just like the boarding schools, they all thought they were doing good.
They really did. There was such a big emphasis on hygiene, which was good. That was sort of, but all mixed up in these kinds of beliefs, and eugenics, we can't underscore. I was really shocked in doing research for the book. I mean, this was not, sort of like junk science. This was part of mainstream education. I mean, this is like taught in courses at Harvard and so on. I mean, people really deeply believe these things. And, until the 1970s, I think in something like 30 states, it was legal to forcibly sterilize people who were thought to be somehow inferior, racially or mentally inferior. So, and that's the 1970s. So not surprisingly, those kinds of beliefs, I think, live on. Today, we can even see it in our current political leadership discussions, regarding certain countries in Africa, and also, these sort of carriers, and we talk about, immigrants, these suggestions that people coming to here from Central and South America bring, quote unquote, bad blood. I mean, I think that harkens back to those old eugenics theories.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've had friends come up to me and ask and talk about trauma affecting genes in some way. And I like how you describe it, sort of a gene expression. And I always dismissed it. I thought, I don't know about that. But in preparing for our conversation, actually, I looked not deeply, but a little more into it and saw, oh, no, there is questions about this. It's not very well understood, but it very well may have some kind of impact on gene expression, which I guess makes sense because trauma is, and responding to trauma is a natural way to survive.
Yeah, and if you're if one thinks of it, it's, you can't believe that somebody actually had to study this to prove it. I mean, if you're in this state of constant hypervigilance, and if you're raised by parents who are in the states of hypervigilance, it has an impact on you, so you might become perhaps more hypervigilant, more, frightened, always just on guard against something happening. I mean, being raised in that environment, even if we don't look at quote unquote the physical impacts, you could certainly see, the mental impacts would be there. It's not like such a mystery, and which always confounds me that it often gets sort of framed as I said, like weakness. Why didn't you just overcome this? It's like, wow, so a lot to quote unquote overcome when so much is really ingrained in you, from childhood.
Annette Pember, it's my understanding that as you were researching for this book, and I think going into congressional records, so you'll correct me if I misremember that part, you unexpectedly came upon your grandmother's own name.
Yes, I did. And I was, I found myself looking, and a lot of the stuff is available online. It's sometimes it's, just copies of the original records, and the type is like really, really tiny. So I would, spend a long time gazing at this tiny type late at night. And I forget exactly what at that time I was kind of pursuing some sort of line of inquiry. And my grandmother's name popped out. And, this is a woman who...
Just there it is. There you are. There you are. You're looking at this, hard to read stuff, and suddenly there's your grandmother's name.
Yes, Pop. And this is a woman I never met. She died just the year before I was born. I heard nothing but really negative things from my mother about her. My mother, even the week my mother died, she spoke poorly about her mother and her mother choosing to survive versus staying to take care of her children. And it turned out that Grandma Seal, as we called her, she spent about like 8 years at the sister school, and I was able to find her enrollment record. And they would have these forms that they printed, and basically they had to fill these out and send them to the federal government so they could get paid for educating these children. And they had a line about why children left, and after Grandma Seal's name, it just said, reason for leaving, no good reason. She just, I don't know, either she got sick of it, or I don't know why she left. But in 9th grade, she dropped out. But she did learn, one of the things they taught them at these schools was about, lessons about civics. There's a great emphasis on, being about citizenship, being involved, voting and so on. And that was a message that was a duty to know about these things. And Grandma Seal must have taken that pretty seriously. She had a brother who was arrested and taken to another reservation, and she made bold to inquire about if there was a warrant, for his arrest. And the Indian agent said, well, no, we don't need one. And she said, well, how is that? She knew about due process. And I was floored. She knew about this, and she challenged it, and actually she wrote letters to her state representatives, who at the time, coincidentally, and fortuitously, were investigating a lot of corruption in the Indian agencies, which in many ways was sort of a place for sort of an entrepreneurial opportunity to be placed in these agencies at that time. And they actually ended up taking her letter, to this congressional hearing, and she sent a notarized letter asking about this, how her brother could be arrested. And she found him. He was like jailed with a ball and chain attached to his leg and with no formal charges, he and a bunch of other Native people. So the upshot is that they let him go. But then I was able to find out more about her. She was described as a responsible woman, and a group of responsible women on the reservation. And she was one of the founders of one of the first Native League of Women Voters. I was able to speak to an archivist with the League of Women's Voters, and they actually had, from the early 1930s, a report that clearly, described my grandmother's efforts and her work, and that they wanted the same thing that we want for our families and our communities. We want, education and support for our children and for the aged. Equal representation, in the courts of law. So, but the amazing thing, none of my relatives have ever heard this about Seal. And at that time, that was shortly after this happened. She had this terrible, blow up with her husband, and he tried to kill her, and she just fled, for her life. But nobody has any recollection of that, that she was just this firebrand, at a time when women's suffrage was just emerging. Native people just got they were granted citizenship. So that was just, it was kind of, I don't know, one doesn't, as a journalist, we believe, quote unquote, in facts, but there was something kind of spiritual about that to me, just to out of nowhere, to see her name jump out. And I will say that there's been a couple of things in this work that have emerged like that. And one could describe it, well, you place yourself in a certain proximity, those things might happen. And if you're attuned to being aware of them. But I sort of choose it to see that in the way that I work, and I have a belief that we are sort of destined, if you will, to be part of something greater than ourselves, to make a contribution. And I think, if you follow kind of what's in front of you, sometimes you can be part of something better, bigger than yourself, and you can help forward, a certain mission. So, yeah, I guess perhaps that sounds a little, crazy, and particularly given the political environment. But I do think that I am part of something really important. And in my small way, I am helping to advance, knowledge and history of what happened to Native people as a result of these assimilationist policies in our country.
Well, when I think about this amazing find, again, you never met your grandmother. She died I think you said a year before you were born.
Correct.
And then finally to have her name show up and learn all these things about her that no one even seemed to remember. I mean, I personally get goosebumps. I got goosebumps listening to that right now and thinking about that connection.
And then there actually is another example. I don't know if you recall reading in the book about finding validation about one of those sister school stories that my mother used to tell me as a child, about a particular sister Catherine, Mother Superior Sister Catherine, who is the principal of St. Mary's boarding schools. And she was particularly harsh. And my mother would often talk, she said she thought that maybe in some ways she had some mental health issues, but she was just extremely brutal. My mother described being beaten after stealing an apple. And when she was quite young, she told me about the story that Sister Mary Catherine, around Christmas time, fell down the cellar steps and hit her head. And she died after a few days. And my mom said, "Oh, us kids did such a silent cheer, because that was the best Christmas present we could have gotten." And that's sort of a story that circulates on the reservation there. So I was at the archives, which for the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, which are currently reside at Marquette Catholic University in Milwaukee, and at the Rayner Collection. And I was looking through all these, administrative back and forth. There really is not a lot of describing the children's lives, to be honest, as far as like their report cards and so on. But I found a letter from the assistant principal at St. Mary's School to the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions in Washington, D.C., saying by the time this letter reaches you, our Mother Superior Catherine will likely have, met her destination in heaven, because a couple days before Christmas, she was going down the cellar steps and she fell down, and the last step hit her head so hard that it drove her glasses into her head, and she is now in a coma. And the sister nurse says it can hardly be a few hours before she passes, and I know you'll join us in prayer for her everlasting salvation. And I read that letter and I stood straight up out of my seat in this archives. Here it was, this sort of smoking gun, for, my childhood of all of these stories. And if I had any doubts, I feel about, the worthiness of this project, they were removed then.
Again, your mom told you many of her stories about the boarding school when you were young. When you were older, you were your mom's caretaker.
Yes.
And it's not unheard of to have complicated relationships with one's parents. That would be your case as well, as you write about. Tell me about your relationship to your mom.
She was always, again, we talk about that hypervigilance, always very fearful and defensive. And then as she aged and developed dementia, it just became untenable. And she had quite a temper, and she was a tiny little person. She was like about 5 feet tall, and probably never weighed more than 100 pounds. But she was a force to be reckoned with. And the people that she eventually we had to place her in a nursing home. And she would really rattle those people. They would call me and say, "You got to come up here and help us because your mom is just really, making everybody crazy." So she was a challenging person. And during that time, she basically warned everybody out, everybody in our family. Although, my brother, certainly, God bless him, he really, went above and beyond. But at that time, I was in recovery, from alcoholism, and I was really struggling with my relationship with her, as many of us struggle with our relationships, alcoholic or otherwise, with our parents. And I would I was going to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I would, spend a lot of time complaining about my relationship with my mom and how she was making me crazy and so on. And I had a sponsor at the time, and that is, I don't know if people know the structure of AA. Other members function as sponsors. It's like a real unofficial thing, but they will offer you support and so on. And my sponsor gave me an assignment, and she said she wanted me to pray for my mother every day. And there were no directives there were no specifics to be part of these prayers. I was just supposed to pray for her to have peace. So I started doing it. And after a time, it was a sort of a strange thing that happened. I just found as though like this kind of dinger descended out of the sky and hit me on the head. I just stopped feeling angry with her. And I think what it really happened is it stopped being about me and my hurt feelings and so on, and more about understanding her and, situating her in her life and all she went through and survived. And I was able to be of service to her for those last years. And that was like a tremendous gift. I stopped having to argue with her and be, correct her and so on. And I would just redirect her, and she would be very concerned that she was always concerned people were stealing from her. And I think that's not uncommon for people to experience as we age. But, I was able to, as I said, be of service to her and, to really, help her going forward. And I was with her when she died. And I didn't have any woulda, coulda, shouldas about our relationship. Of course, it was more painful than her passing was more painful than I imagined it would be. Nothing's ever all stitched up and so on. And, but it was like probably the greatest gift I ever got in my whole life, really, is just the release of this anger and resentment towards her and realizing it wasn't about me. It was in response to what happened to her. And I think that's part of, if you get into all these sort of trauma sciences and of course it's, some of these ways of looking at trauma, some people have debunked them. And I mean, one can get quite deep into these, various ways of viewing it. However, I will say that, having an understanding of what has happened to other people and why they may be doing what they're doing or reacting in this way is useful. In a lot of ways, it's useful emotionally, and it's useful mentally, and it was useful for me.
You had insight into your mom. I mean, you sort of saw where some of maybe. Do you think some of these tendencies, and look, people can be difficult, anyways, but do you think that some of these tendencies were directly related to the boarding school experience?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I do think so. That messaging, that fearfulness, that hypervigilance, always being on defense. She had such an enormous chip on her shoulder because she was always under attack, growing up. And it's not surprising that one would emerge, with those kinds of tendencies. So it really helped me understand her more and kind of released, my blaming, her for not being a good enough mother. And actually, in retrospect, I was able to say she did an incredible job. I mean, she gave me something and my brother something she never could have dreamed of as a child. She stayed, and she housed us and fed us. She was a little crazy sometimes, but, she did keep us safe. And
do you think she was motivated to do that because of her? I mean, we're naturally motivated to do that anyways, but also her having to go to a boarding school and being felt, I think, abandoned by her mom.
Oh yeah, I think very much so. But she didn't really know how to parent us because she had no experience of parenting. But that was her great dream, I think. To have a family. And she was funny. She would always describe her family as close. And I would think to myself, who are you talking about? The neighbors? Because I don't feel like our family's close. I feel like we're just sort of hanging on and surviving, by our toenails. But for her, she realized her great dream. She, became a parent and raised a family.
It's interesting to me that I think you called it a dinger. A dinger came when suddenly you sort of saw your mom in a little bit of a different way, and it sounded like through prayer. You were praying for her and kind of led up to that. And I might be going way out of into left field here, but it reminds me of a Buddhist meditation called loving kindness, where you meditate on, wishing yourself love and kindness, but then also the person that you're struggling with or even don't like.
Yeah, and that's why I call it a dinger and not a magic wand, or I don't really want to connect it to anything necessarily like, specific religion or spirituality or anything, but just, kind of surrendering to the great mystery, whatever that is for you,
Sometimes they send you dingers.
Yeah, with these dingers, right?
Mary Annette Pember has been our guest. Again, Mary Annette Pember is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Wisconsin Ojibwe. She is currently national correspondent for ICT News, formerly known as Indian Country Today, and she has joined us for a conversation about her memoir. It's called Medicine River, a story of survival and the legacy of Indian boarding schools. Mary Annette Pember, that was a very deep story that you told, and I thank you for your willingness to tell it to us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mitch. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
That does it for Letters and Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Kirsten Thomas is the engineer. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.
Dude, you've been glued to that phone for like a half an hour. What's going on?
Just keeping up with the news, doing my research.
Okay. And what's the word out there, Mr. Research?
Man, I don't even know. It's like wars, hurricanes, billionaires tweeting at each other. Or is it Xing now? Robots stealing jobs, robots with machine gun heads, AI girlfriends. Wait, is TikTok banned again or not?
Wow. A masterclass in knowing everything and understanding nothing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Let's skip the chaos buffet and let KPFA feed you with actual news and context.
Oh, wow. So I don't have to decode memes to know what's real?
Exactly. KPFA. News and current events without the nonsense.
94.1.
What's in a building? When it comes to KPFA, everything. For over 75 years, KPFA has broadcast truth to power, and for decades, 1929 Martin Luther King Jr. Way has been our home, a hub for free speech, cultural resistance, and community radio. Now it's time to make that legacy official. On Tuesday, November 4th at 6:30 p.m., the City of Berkeley's Landmark Preservation Committee will meet to consider landmark status for the KPFA building. There will be time for public comment. Your voice and presence matter. Join us at Berkeley Senior Center, 1901 Hearst Avenue, and help honor KPFA's past, protect its present, and preserve its future. Because KPFA is more than a building. It's a legacy worth protecting.
This is 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF Fresno, online, kpfa.org.
KPFA.
Protect KPFA at all costs means standing guard over one of the last truly independent media outposts. No corporate leash, no government filter, no billionaire puppeteers. Unbought and unbossed. It's a call to action, a mindset, A line in the sand. Defend truth tellers, amplify the unheard, and keep the airwaves free for the people. We've got 59,000 watts of radical truth, and we're not turning it down for anyone.
This is 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online everywhere at kpfa.org.